Now, when I start with the axial skeleton, I like to start with the vertebrae. And we're going to have 5 regions of our vertebrae. However, 3 of them we will find distinct vertebrae, whereas 2 of them will have fused together vertebrae. So just inferior to the skull, you will find cervical vertebra. You have 7 of those. As I move inferior to the cervical vertebra, I will then find my 12 thoracic vertebrae and my 5 lumbar vertebrae, which is easy to remember if you remember that breakfast is at 7, lunch is at noon, 12, and dinner is at 5. Now, with the sacrum and coccyx, they look a bit different because they fuse together. Now, I don't have a good disarticulated real bone for this, but a lot of the models just kind of stamp them all in one press. Generally, the coccyx is separate from the sacrum. There is a joint you can dissolve with the right kind of enzymes. And the sacrum is usually made up of a fused 4 to 6 vertebrae, the coccyx a fused 3 to 5 vertebrae, and so we can just shorthand it and say there's 5 vertebrae in the sacra and there are 4 vertebrae in the coccyx. We will come back to this structure later on. Now, the ones that are separate or disarticulated in our angle here also have generally 3 main regions, cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. However, the first 2 vertebrae will be a little bit different. I will also come back to these ones because we need to know them individually. The other vertebrae, we can just learn them as a generic cervical, thoracic, or lumbar vertebrae. So, when we start with this, I think it's easier to start with thoracic. They kind of have the most distinct structures, or I shouldn't say that, but they're right in the middle, so they'll have a bit of everything. Now, when I look at a thoracic vertebra, this one we are looking at from the superior angle, inferior, so there would be an inferior vertebra below it. The posterior direction is that way, and anterior is that way. So I'll leave those up so that you don't get lost. Now, as I look at this, on the anterior aspect of the vertebra is going to be the body. This is what supports the weight. In between each vertebra, you will have an intervertebral fibrocartilage disc that helps to cushion that, but this is what's going to be carrying that mass in this bone. Then you have 2 extensions, one on either side, that go posteriorly, and then they arc out to form this process called a transverse process. Now, the base of the process is going to be what we call the pedicle, and then that process then sort of melds across to the spinous process, which goes out here, forming the lamina. Now, I think a little easier way to remember what this is if I look down the vertebral foramen, which this is where the spinal cord would be, the walls of this, if I were to think of it as a house, the walls of this would be the pedicles, the roof of it would be the lamina. The base or the floor of the house is our body. Okay, so we have a body, we have a vertebral foramen, bounded on 2 lateral sides by the pedicles or posteriorly, by the lamina. And then from the walls of my house come out these extensions or growths that are my transverse processes on each lateral side and my spinous process coming right off the peak or the roof of the house. Now, if I turn this to the sides, now we're looking at this laterally, then I can see a few other features. So each vertebra must articulate with the vertebra above and below it. And so it will need to have a process that extends down and interacts with that. And that's what we're seeing right here. This is the inferior articular process. And then here is the superior articular process. It tells us what it's doing. Superior, it's on the top. Articular means it's joining with another bone. Process means it's an extension of bone. On this process, you will find a smooth, flat surface called the superior articular facet. The same with the inferior surface. And if I were to put 2 vertebrae together, I would find that this notch right here forms a complete circle. And so I have an intervertebral foramen when I have 2 vertebrae stacked. However, with just one, I have an intervertebral notch. Now, on a thoracic vertebra, it is a little bit different because thoracic vertebra will articulate or join with ribs. And your ribs don't just go one rib to one vertebra, they actually touch 2 vertebrae, one above and one below. And so what I see is this little kind of ridge right here. This is called the inferior costal facet. This will be where the rib, part of the rib, will articulate. It will also articulate with the superior costal facet of the next vertebra down. And we can see that right here, another smoothed off area where there is an articulation. There would be cartilage on there and you'd have your ribs anchoring. Now the rib that that is attaching to this vertebra will also interact at a second point on this transverse process, where we have a transverse costal facet right here. Now that about covers it for our thoracic vertebrae. Just as a quick aside, an easy way to tell a thoracic vertebra is if you hold it like this, it looks a bit like a giraffe. Nose, I always forget horns and ears. One of the two are horns and ears, but you get a vaguely giraffe-like appearance there. Now, if we were to compare that thoracic vertebra with the chunkier, beefier lumbar vertebra, that one looks a bit like a moose, more from the side for me, big moose nose. So easy to tell thoracic and lumbar vertebra apart based on just the animal shapes. Lumbar vertebrae carry a lot more weight, so they just generally are a lot bulkier. We can tell a cervical vertebra apart not because of an animal, but because of a very easy marking that we find. And this is where we have these foramina, which means a little hole, on either side of the foramen that is the vertebral foramen. So since they are lateral, we call these the transverse foramina. They will only ever be present in the cervical vertebrae, and they're on kind of the base of the transverse processes. We see cervical vertebrae also have a superior articular process and an inferior articular process. They will not have costal facets, though, because ribs don't articulate with the cervical vertebrae. The cervical vertebrae will also have a spinous process, meaning that it has a vertebral canal. The base of the spinal process and base of the transverse processes will make up the kind of walls and roof of that vertebral canal. So you have also pedicles and lamina forming that full circle, and then the body of the cervical vertebrae here. Now lumbar vertebrae, those will look a little bit different because they carry a lot of weight. There's only 5 of these. They have a very enlarged, solid, usually heart-shaped body. This is because it is carrying all of the weight of everything above it. So each vertebra has to carry everything above plus the layer of tissue that it is a part of, developmentally the somae. Now, as I look at this, I can see that there are still the same structures, but they take a slightly different appearance because of the just overall bulk of this bone. So posteriorly, I have a spinous process. Laterally, I have transverse processes. Coming from the top, angling superiorly, I have my superior articular process, and I have my inferior articular process with an intervertebral notch, which would form the foramen with the next vertebra below it. So you have kind of your basic idea of the 3 main vertebral regions there. Now we do have to layer in a little bit more. And so we do have cervical 1 and cervical 2. Now, cervical 1 and cervical 2 look particularly different from other cervical vertebrae, and so we need to know them as their individual names. The atlas and the axis are cervical number 1 and cervical number 2. Now they both still have transverse foramina. You can see that on all 4 of these bones, which is our dead giveaway that we're working with the cervical vertebra, but other than that, they do have some differences. Now, this articulated, as in joined one, will show you the motion that they can do. However, look at them separate first. Cervical vertebra number 1 supports the weight of the skull, hence why it's called the atlas. It has these condyles, the supraarticular facets. This will then articulate with the occipital condyles of the occipital bone. The vertebral foramen is huge here because it is still very a large structure tapering down to the spinal cord. And we see large transverse foramina. This does not have a body and it barely has a spinous process. You can usually see a little nub. So the body of the cervical vertebra number 1 does exist, it just gets lost. And during development, the body of the cervical vertebra number 1 fuses with cervical vertebra number 2, the axis. This has the same features: superior articular processes and facets, transverse foramina, transverse process, spinous process, vertebral foramen, and a body. However, its body gets glued on with the body of cervical 1, and so it gets this process coming out called the dens, or the odontoid process. I like dens because I'm lazy and I don't like to spell odontoid process. But that's a dead giveaway that you're looking at cervical vertebra number 2. Now, the features of these bones allow them to articulate or move in a particular fashion. So the cupped faces of the superior articular facets of cervical number 1 allow your head to nod. So if you're nodding, like the motion for yes, a lot of that motion is allowed because of the exaggerated articular surfaces that we see in cervical 1. When you turn your head left to right to indicate no, you'll get motion pivoting around the cervical 1 to cervical 2 joint. The DINS allows or acts as an axis of pivot, hence the name of cervical 2 as the axis for that motion. Now clearly you can't go too far because you do not want these two holes to misalign. That's how you get a spinal dislocation where you've now severed that. So this should get us through our main vertebrae. We then have the sacrum and coccyx. Now the sacrum is a fused 4 to 6 bones, and we don't really see the fusion lines anymore. This is a pretty solid bone. But we can see the features of those bones. So there is a bit of nubs sticking up along here. And so we call that the median sacral crest, and that's what's left over of our spinous processes. We also will have a lateral sacral crest that runs down along here. And we will see the occasional openings or pathways, which are called sacral foramina, in that bone as well. Now, we will also have, if I look up here, an articular process, and this won't match exactly, but we should be able to see roughly how this works, where a lumbar vertebra would sit in here. So we do have the superior articular process, but the inferior is lost as all these bones fuse together. You then have these lateral extensions of the sacral bone. These are called the ala. And if I were to look on its side, you would find a rough surface along here, and this is the auricular surface that will then tightly bind with your hip bones, the ilium, ischium, and pubis together as the os coxa, forming the pelvis. We do get a few, again, evidence of, the fusion bones. So we have these lines that move transversely across here. And I don't believe this model shows it, but you would have an opening into the sacral canal, which is an extension of the vertebral foramen. But again, this is just a generic plastic model. I don't have a good disarticulated real one to work with. Our coccyx, which is all the way at the inferior, this is 3 to 5, so we'll just say 4 using the average. 3 to 5 fused vertebrae, and we don't really need to know anything structurally on this, but this is what people refer to usually as the tailbone itself. And that should get you through the vertebral column. This isn't in the vertebral column, but it's an easy one to tag on here before I do the skull. And so this is the sternum. And in this case, we are going to be looking at the inferior direction this way and superior direction that way. So then lateral is going to go off on either side. And then the sternum is about as medial as you can get. So your mid-sagittal plane would cut right through here. Now the sternum is actually 3 bones that fuse together in development, and so the bone itself, we'll say if we identify this bone as the sternum, but if we ask you to identify a specific region, that would be the manubrium, the body of the sternum, and the xiphoid process. We do have costal cartilages attaching to this. These are hyaline cartilage, and they will attach to the ribs on either side. Now when we look at our ribs, we're back to a good real bone again. Our ribs, they are going to have, for us, very few features. If you're not at Chemeketa, I apologize. I am not going to go over much of this. But the main thing we need to be able to do is to identify the rib as a rib. You can tell which side will face the vertebra because in this one we actually see there's a bit of the fake cartilage that they added to this skeleton to anchor it, but it will be a flat cutoff because it just ends at cartilage, almost like somebody took a knife and just cut perfectly through it. Whereas the posterior aspect of a rib is going to be a little more lumpy, and you will see some tubercles and rough patches on it because this is what's articulating with your vertebrae. So now I can tell which way of the rib is facing or is on the posterior side versus the anterior side. So my right hand is anterior, my left hand is posterior. I then look for this costal groove. This is where you will find the arteries, veins, and nerves for the intercostal muscles, the ones that help you breathe in and out traveling. And this groove then is going to tell me what faces inferiorly. So the sharp point, which is edge of the rib, I should say, which is caused by the groove. Feels like a butter knife, faces inferiorly. This is posterior, and this is anterior. So if I were to put this on my own body, imagine me standing up in my torso here, this would be a left rib. And that's all we have to worry about on our ribs for our class.